I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, but before I do that, I have the unfortunate obligation to share some sad news with you, which is that Catherine Kelleher, who was the founder of CISM, one of the founding members of the school, passed away yesterday. She's been sick for a long time, but was able to be really alert and engaged up until the end, and still getting messages from people at the school of support, still letting us know how much we all mean to her. We're going to have the annual Kelleher Forum next, or two Thursdays from now. So not next week, but the following week. We were already planning to have Lena Andrews speak about her new book on the role of women in World War II. And I consulted with Catherine's daughter, and she said, oh, Catherine would want you to carry on. So that's what we'll do. And then there'll be a larger, more public memorial service for her sometime end of this semester. So just wanted to share that sad news with you. I do not want that to distract from our good fortune today of having Vladimir Brovnik here with us. He was a visiting Fulbright Fellow at CISM in 2002, which is when I first got to know him. He's an associate professor at the University of Odessa in Ukraine, and is here for a year as a visiting scholar at Tufts University. He's written extensively on a number of topics related to security in and around Ukraine. I'm not going to list them all because I know you want to hear what he has to say. I'll simply mention that he told me that on this brief visit to Washington, D.C., he's giving 7 different talks on 7 different topics, which just goes to show you how much hunger there is.
17 topics.
Yes, for people to hear firsthand about what's going on in Ukraine and what should be done about it. So thank you very much.
So I really appreciate you having us here and me here, and it's a great pleasure. Great pleasure. Indeed, University of Maryland has a special place in my heart for it because of that fellowship I had in 2002 with the Center of International Security Studies at Maryland here, working with people here, you of course, and then others like Steve Fetter, like Mac Gassler, like John Steinbrunner, like many others, and, but not only that, but also my involvement with the University of Maryland goes way beyond that, because actually we've been working with Department of Government and Politics at least since 1990s. That department was chaired at that point of time, of course, by Karen Dowisha, who's not with us anymore for the last few years. She passed away, but she was a formidable person there. She ran a program and she ran a project, actually, which was called Russian Literature Project. And one of the conferences she's done in the region, in Ukraine, was in Odessa. And I helped her deal with it, and I kind of hosted it in many ways. And that was in 1995. And then also, of course, we had a program, co-educational, co-administered by University of Maryland on one hand, and University of Odessa National University on the other, which was called Odessa Public Policy. So it was there in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Karen Dowisha was actually the first co-chair of that program, co-director on the Maryland side. And then her place was taken by my good old friend who's here, David Falk, who was also a co-director of that program after Karen, on the Maryland side. And I was involved. Formerly, I was known as their, kind of liaison in Odessa, but I was very much involved in running that program. So as you can see, really my connection to University of Maryland is very special, to me at least. It's been ongoing for a number of years, except that I haven't been here for a while. I've never been to this building. It's such a nice building, and it's such a nice room. and as I approached this room, I noticed immediately it's called a Schelling room. I don't know if everyone here is aware of the fact who Thomas Schelling was, but I knew him. And I met him a number of times, and I met him a number of times when he was here, and I met him before he got his Nobel Prize, and I met him after too. And of course, he's an absolutely legendary, iconic figure in our field. One of the courses I teach back home is the theory of international conflict. And of course, how not to mention his seminal work on this subject, on strategy of conflict, management of international conflict from the 1960s. And such a pleasure and real honor for me, to be here speaking in this room, which is named after a person whom I definitely every year when I teach my courses to my students back home, I would mention Thomas Schelling. So there's, as you can see, there are so many, emotional connections and moments for me here. And in some ways it's homecoming. Yeah, and I still teach courses, by the way, for Ukraine students online. I did 2 courses in the spring of last year, and I did 2 online courses in the fall of last year. So actually in the fall, I was already here teaching at Tufts, but I also continued teaching, for my hometown students. And right now we have a winter break, but in March, the classes will resume in Odessa, so we'll see if it's going to be offline or online. If it's going to be online, I'm going to be continue teaching my courses there. But for the time being, indeed, as been mentioned already, I am a visiting professor at the University of Tufts University, so with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy there. I taught a course, on the Black Sea regional security last fall. And I'm teaching now a different course there called Ukraine Security and Foreign Policy. But we're going to talk about Black Sea security today, because there's so much going on there. And I think that what happens in the wider Black Sea region really has an impact, a lot of implications for a lot of countries in the region and beyond the region, really. We've been talking about the Black Sea region being from Odessa on the coast of Black Sea for years and years, decades really, like what's going on with the regional security. And but now, since the start of this massive Russian invasion, not the start of Russian war against Ukraine, because the war started in 2014, but since the start of this more of a massive escalatory stage of the war since February 24th last year, we talk about Black Sea region even more so, because there's so many things that are happening there. So when the Cold War was over, let me remind you, there were kind of optimistic expectations for the region. People thought that maybe we can somehow overcome the conflicts and lack of trust maybe in the region, and maybe the countries of the region can come together in this kind of a universalist / idealist collective security spirit and deal with issues in the region together. I remember us living under this assumption for a long time, and actually saying, okay, well, let's focus maybe not on what divides us, but focus on things that connect us, like trade, like dealing with the energy situation, like dealing with maybe fighting the illegal migration in the region, stuff like that, maybe together addressing the issue of environmental degradation, which is an acute challenge for a lot of places around the Black Sea, specifically where I live, northern littoral of the Black Sea, the South Ukraine coast, in Odessa, it's really terrible situation with both air pollution and water pollution as well. So people were kind of thinking along those lines, the functionalist logic, let us get together, let us maybe depoliticize what we do in the region, let us focus on this cooperation, but also functionalist in the way that let's not only allow our states to establish or formulate the agenda for cooperation, but let's also do region to region, city to city, and been tons of this. There've been some people suggesting creation of a Euro region in the Black Sea. So for the regions in the countries like Odessa, for instance, on Black Sea, working with neighboring regions in, say, Romania, and then across the sea with Turkey and so on. But later on, unfortunately, there's been more and more of a assertion and understanding that, maybe this kind of rosy situation is not going to materialize quite fully. For one thing, we had some conflicts in the region after all. The Black Sea region is kind of surrounded by various conflicts. And a lot of people would actually use the term, which was, I think, once coined, or at least advanced extensively by late analyst, very well-known writer of this subject, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who once was a national security advisor under President Jimmy Carter, but of course, he wrote lots of very interesting books on the subject, and he said, well, this is what we have here. We have this arc of instability. Because if you look on other side, various sides of the Black Sea region, you have Balkans nearby. Well, Balkans is basically synonymous with instability. You know, you even have a term Balkanization, right? You know, then you have the Transnistria, which is a kind of a breakaway unrecognized republic in the southeast part of Moldova, very close to my hometown of Odessa. It's less than an hour drive really from Odessa to Transnistria. Then, of course, you have another side. You have Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, and them having their goal at the conflict and confrontation. And then, of course, you have two breakaway regions in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And if you complete the circle, you know, you go to Greater Middle East, you go to places like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Iran, like Syria, you know, like Eastern Mediterranean with Cyprus there. So, yeah, some people would say, okay, Ukraine is there on that arc of instability, but somehow successfully fine and safe from a conflict. Even though a lot of people were thinking for a long time about the Crimea, for instance, as being a potentially explosive issue. We knew from the very beginning that Russia has very special feelings for Crimea, affinity, that a lot of Russians would probably subscribe to the point of view that it's not fair, there's some kind of historic mistake or aberration that Crimea is actually within Ukraine's borders. Even in the early 1990s, there was a statement by Russian Duma, Russian parliament, that, well, we should consider maybe making Crimea part of Russia. And that it was walked back in the early 90s by President Yeltsin and his very liberal pro-Western foreign minister, Mr. Kozyrev. They immediately produced a statement when they said, no, of course, Duma is not speaking on behalf of Russia. We are executive power there. So we don't have any problems with Crimea being part of Ukraine. And a number of treaties were signed and agreements between Russia and Ukraine over the years and decades, where Russia recognized fully territorial integrity of Ukraine, right? So that we need to remember now, like, because in terms of international law, Russia is in violation of a number of agreements, you know, and of course the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1994 as well. I'm sure that maybe in this room, many people would know what it was about. So Ukraine was denuclearizing, giving up whatever nuclear weapons we inherited when Soviet Union broke up. And in return, you know, the document was signed where Ukraine received assurances of security from US, UK, and Russia. And the similar documents, by the way, were signed by two other major nuclear powers, being China and France, with Ukraine. And I think Ukraine actually should probably remind in a more active way, to China at least, that they actually signed a similar document, you know, assuring Ukraine of its assistance in case Ukraine is under attack. I mean, so we'll see. But time passed on, and there were more distrust and anxiety in the region and confrontation. One important event took place in 2008 when Georgia was attacked by Russia. There was a wake-up call to some people, maybe. That was a manifestation of the fact that Black Sea doesn't have enough security for itself and by itself, even though some major countries in the region were basically saying, we're fine, everything's safe here, everything's stable. You know, we don't want outside players, meaning primarily the United States, intervening in the region, interfering with regional affairs. But then 2008 happened. And of course, it wasn't a massive war, it was a 5 days war, they call it, in August 2008. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the West basically turned a blind eye to it. You know, that was a predominant reaction. NATO still was pretty much interested in working with Russia, specifically because of this northern distribution route into Afghanistan that they needed. US, at that point of time, when the Russian aggression against Georgia happened, both candidates for presidency, it was in the middle of election campaign 2008, they made critical statements about what Russia did to Georgia. But immediately when Barack Obama became president in early 2009, the reset happened. We saw the new stage in relations with Russia, which was based on the assumption that you can get along with Russia, you can talk with Russia, you need Russia, Russia can be a collaborative, responsible partner for the United States, and so on. So in many ways, it was definitely a wrong signal to Russia, because you just soft and fresh out of this aggression into Georgia. And what does the collective West does? It turns the blind eyes and basically says, never mind, we basically don't notice what you did to Georgia. Let us cooperate more. And people in Moscow, don't get me wrong, they always got those messages. Oh, okay, that's fine. They gave us a green light. It's a carte blanche, it's a mandate for us to do something like this in the coming years. They don't mind. So it's like a signal of weakness in many ways. And that's, a lot of people were said before it was 2008, like what Russia did in Georgia, probably not going to happen, but it did. And then people said, okay, but Ukraine is a different case. It's a much bigger country, bigger military. It's unthinkable even to imagine that Russia is going to use military forces against Ukraine. And then 2014 came, of course, and Russia took away Crimea, de facto occupied Crimea, and of course proceeded with aggression in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. So then people said, okay, those are kind of regional, small, minor incursions, so we shouldn't derive from it the notion that Russia might actually proceed with more massive attack against Ukraine. And then February of 2022 happened. So, I guess it's a certain teaching moment there. In those moments, I'm just reminded to you, in terms of someone saying today, maybe, oh, it's unthinkable, it's not feasible to even contemplate that Russia might attack a NATO member, for instance, in the region, one of the Baltic countries, or Romania, someone else, Poland. And I would probably say, through the light of what I just told you, never say never. Russia is actually capable of some things, like what Putin did since February 24th, of course, does not really, fit into any rational decision-making theory. It really undermines what we knew about Putin for a number of years, that he's actually a very cautious guy who plans his moves ahead. He's a rational decision maker, but now probably not so much anymore. Maybe not rational anymore, maybe rational, maybe someone who's bargaining, someone who's capable of decisions that are not well planned through. So going back to the Black Sea region, of course, occupation of Crimea already jeopardized any stability in the region and trust in the region. But what is happening since February of last year, it's even more so. It's a dominating situation, feeling in the region is anxiety. Everyone is very anxious about what Russia does, and everyone's trying to see what their position should be vis-a-vis Russian aggression. For instance, Turkey is really balancing between both East and West. Russia and Ukraine. They've been doing this balancing act for a long time now. That's been pretty much characteristic of their foreign policy for a number of years now. They don't really want to take sides. When it comes to Ukraine's territorial integrity, their position is clear. They do not recognize any of those annexations, starting from Crimea, going to any other regions of recent times, being part of Russia. But at the same time, they're not part of sanctions on Russia. They've been using actively, actually, a situation when Russia was under sanctions. So ships from a number of countries were not coming to Crimea, but from Turkey they were. They actually had to capitalize on the situation when Turkish ships were coming to Crimea and actually benefiting enormously from the sanctions, of which Turkey was not part of. They stopped doing that at some point of time. But still, they're working with Russia in Syria. They appreciate Russia not interfering in any destructive way for Turkey with the Kurdish situation. So they get a lot of energy from Russia and so on. And even since February of last year, Turkey said we're going to continue trading with Russia. If Russian people want to come to Turkey, they're welcome. If Russian oligarchs sanctioned by the West want to come to Turkey, they're welcome. So at the same time, Turkey works intensively with Ukraine. Turkey is selling the drones, so-called Bayraktar drones, to Ukraine. It's not a small deal, especially if you consider that Bayraktar company is owned by someone who's a member of the family of President Erdogan. So you would understand, if you know a thing or two about Turkey, this is really sanctioned by at the very top of the Turkish government. So, and Erdogan made a visit to Ukraine, formally, physically in person. And he said, Slava Ukraini, he said, glory to Ukraine, to greet and cheer Ukrainian troops, meeting with him and so on. So he's really playing both sides, which is probably to the benefit of Ukraine in some ways. I mean, you would probably, if you're Ukraine, you would probably like Turkey to take a stronger position on Russian aggression. But what I mean by the benefit, you might need his mediatory efforts. And Turkey was involved very much so in putting together the so-called grain deal, which is there since July 23rd last year. I should remind you, maybe probably most of you know, that Russia has introduced a blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea coast during the war. In fact, that blockade precedes a little bit the start of the massive invasion. So that's interesting because even prior to February 24th, for some time, there was already a blockade introduced there. So the Russian battleships were actually there, preventing ships from whatever countries, not just Ukraine, entering Ukraine's Black Sea ports or leaving Ukraine's Black Sea ports. And by enforcing the blockade, so when the February 24th started, and some of the ships under banners, flags of various countries decided to try and leave, they were physically, by force, prevented by Russian battleships. They were shelled. Some of them were shelled. One of them was sank, in Ukraine's territorial water. So they were serious about implementing the blockade. And there were 98 ships that got blocked in Ukraine's Black Sea ports, specifically Odessa, but also other ports, because Kherson is also a port, Mykolaiv is also a port, and two ports on two sides of Odessa, one being Yuzhny, or Pivdenne, in the Ukrainian, on the other side, Port Ilychivsk, now called Chernomor. So three of them are three big ports that are really responsible for the foreign trade of Ukraine. And that was, of course, an enormous blow for Ukraine's economy, for Ukraine's agriculture in the south. Because that's exactly what you had. And Odessa economy, specifically in my hometown, Odessa historically has been benefiting enormously from the transit trade, specifically grain, wheat trade coming through. Ukraine was historically known as the breadbasket of Europe. So at least since the middle of the 19th century, Odessa was a major kind of gateway into that region, and benefiting enormously. So now, since February, until the end of July, nothing of that sort was happening, no trade whatsoever. And of course, you're aware that the implications of the situation got well beyond Ukraine. And people noticed not receiving enough of that wheat and rye and sunflower oil and fertilizers and other things, all the way from Africa to like Sri Lanka. It was a global food crisis. First of all, Ukraine was blocked. Second of all, Russia was also under sanctions, so when grain deal was signed, it was probably a good move for Russia because some of the sanctions on Russia were eased because of that grain deal. And they also appeared as more or less reasonable power, okay, we're fine with the grain deal. So at some point in time, Russians were not that enthusiastic about grain deal anymore. And they even left the grain deal for 2 days. And they basically made a formal statement, we are not part of the grain deal anymore. But then they thought again about it and they came back. That's interesting. What right now is happening, of course, with the trade is that Russia is part of this multilateral inspection mechanism, which is based in Turkey, and they're trying to delay the passage of the ships. So it's a long line, it's a long queue of the ships coming through this inspection mechanism. Many dozens of ships. Russia is deliberately, artificially delaying the passage of those ships, but they're still part of it. One of the things why Russia decided that they're going to still be part of the grain deal is that they probably were not sure if they can actually enforce blockade anymore. Well, because, you couldn't quite get close to Ukrainian coast for various reasons. First of all, the sea is mined. Second of all, Ukraine now has capabilities of striking Russian battleships to the extent that they are trying to get as far away from the Ukraine coast as they can. And they actually can be also found and targeted, even in their main base in occupied Crimea and Sevastopol, and even in Novorossiysk, which is in the rest of Russia, where there was one case at least when Ukrainians proved its ability to strike targets even there with naval drones. You know, it actually wasn't the battleship which was attacked. It was actually one of the Russian industrial kind of transit trade facilities there. But also we have the ships. I mean, the ships, not so much the ships because the Ukraine Navy basically doesn't exist, very small one. But we had the anti-ship missiles, and of course the biggest manifestation of Ukraine's growing prowess in that respect was sinking of Russian battleship, flagship of Russian naval presence in the region called Moscow. So there was something, and not only in addition to the missiles that we actually produced in Ukraine called Neptunes, which were used in that strike on Moscow. We now got some Harpoon missiles produced here in this country, provided actually by Denmark on the consent of the United States. So we have this anti-ship missiles capabilities. That's one of the reasons Russians are really keeping away from Ukraine's coast. And if you want to enforce blockade, that's not a very comfortable position for Russian Navy. So you can still maybe catch up with those ships, cargo ships, somewhere else in international waters and detain them. But that would be really a clear-cut case of like piracy. And probably Russia didn't want to do it, you know. So that's why they kind of forced right now to be continuing being okay for the time being with Green Deal. What else happened, of course, in addition, you had multiple military scenarios, like I, for instance, left Odessa even prior to February 24th. Last year, because I was expecting Russia maybe to strike Odessa directly. There was a lot of rumors out there that Russia might actually forego Kherson, Mykolaiv, and go straight to Odessa. They decided not to do it. They decided to bring their land forces closer to Odessa, and then maybe use their military presence in Transnistria, and then do maybe a amphibious landing operation by their navy. So basically attack Odessa from 3 sides. Didn't happen quite well they planned on all sides. On the land, in terms of land forces, they got stuck near Mykolaiv. They took Kherson quickly. When they got to Mykolaiv, they got stuck there. They met there what military strategists and experts call a culminating moment. So basically, they couldn't advance anymore there. They tried to circumvent Mykolaiv from the north. They got decisively defeated near Voznesensk, and they abandoned any attempt to move further west from that point in time. In Transnistria, actually, they have not much to talk about. They have like 1,500 troops, which is basically mostly locals, not even regular Russian military, not very well trained, not very well equipped. So they couldn't really use it as a serious force to attack Odessa or Ukraine. And in terms of amphibious landing operation, the mines, the missiles, apparently, allegedly, rumors had it that at some point of time they were inclining to do an amphibious landing operation. But what happened, there was a riot on some of those ships because they understood that we're going to go into the situation when we'll be wiped out really quickly. They step on those beaches. The beaches in Odessa are mined as well. And you have quite strong coast artillery as well. And the Snake Island was taken, you know, the island which early in the war Russia took away from Ukraine, but Ukraine got it back. Being really creative, because the Snake Island, for instance, was beyond the distance that Ukraine could actually cover. So what did Ukrainians do? You know, they put the French and Ukrainian cannons, you know, big guns, on the floating platform, and drove and dragged those floating platforms closer to Snake Island, so it would be within reach and sheltered intensively. And Russians understood that they are not capable of maintaining their control of the island, so they just retreated. And of course, they created tons of memes along the way, because they said it's our good gesture, you know, kind of goodwill gesture, that we are retreating from Snake Island, even though it was completely impossible for them to maintain control because it was under direct fire of Ukrainian troops now. So we also, you know, really hit hard some of the oil rigs in the region, which Russia took away by force back in 2014. And Ukraine did strike some of those oil rigs in the region. So, I mean, that was really something to think about, not just in terms of the future of the Black Sea region, but basically the future of naval power around the globe. How is it even possible that you have one country having this total domination Navy-wise? That's Russia. Not only they have the Black Sea Navy, but they also brought, prior to the aggression, they brought 3 large landing ships from Northern Sea and 3 large landing ships from the Baltic Sea. They moved them through the Mediterranean/Black Sea, straits, Bosphorus and Dardanelles. And everyone was expecting them to use them successfully and actively, but that's not what's happening. So basically their usage of the Black Sea Navy that they have is limited to launching missiles at Ukraine. But you can do it from not a battleship. You don't need battleship to launch missiles at Ukraine. They can do it from Crimea, they can do it from Caspian region, they can do it from airplane, they're doing it all the time. So from Russia proper, so to speak. So that's what's going on there. And it's interesting what's happening in the region right now, because of course, people wonder like what can happen next, militarily wise. The correlation of forces, does it even matter? Actually the similar thing with Air Force. We'll see. Some people now consider that maybe in the future attempts to do an offensive against Ukraine, Russia might use Air Force more than it did before, but we'll see, because actually Ukraine also proved very capable of air defense, even prior to receiving some very contemporary, very good air defense systems from Western allies. Even with the Soviet-made systems, they've downed quite a few of Russian airplanes. So I don't think Russia would actually dare to move into Ukraine's airspace with their Air Force. Speaking back about the Black Sea region, I mean, other countries are dealing about the whole situation in their own way. For instance, Georgia is an interesting case. Georgia has been allied with Ukraine for a long time. Georgia has been really seen often as a part of the duo of 2 countries team, Ukraine and Georgia, in many ways. I mean, for instance, we've been trying to get to NATO together. And back in Bucharest summit of NATO in 2008 in Bucharest and Romania, there was a decision made about both countries, which was kind of clumsy and awkward decision, it turns out, that it was announced that one day Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. Why was it awkward? Because both countries haven't got any actual plan, which is normally called membership action plan, MAP or MAP, in terms of membership. But also it triggered Russia in many ways, because it was said that one day Georgia and Ukraine will be invited to become parts of NATO, members of NATO. So it's a failure on both sides. On one side, you don't really give mechanism and tools to both countries to work towards membership. On the other hand, you cannot say publicly, promise that they'll be invited one day to become members of NATO, which probably pushes Russia to do something to undermine that potential option of them becoming member states. So there's no mistake that one, you have a summit and look at a summit, and then several months later, Russia attacks Georgia to basically undermine any chances for Georgia to become a member of NATO. Same thing with the EU. We've been pushing to become closer to EU. We've received the visa-free regime to more or less together. Georgia a little before, a little earlier than Ukraine. We have been always seen as 2 major allies. When Georgia was attacked, Ukraine's President Yushchenko, together actually with presidents of Baltic countries and former President Kaczynski in Poland, they got on the planes and got to Tbilisi, and they spoke in this massive demonstration there in the capital of Georgia, supporting Georgia. So when all of that was happening, but now Georgian government is different from what you had in place before. Actually, the former president Saakashvili is in jail and presumably in Georgia, and presumably in not a very good health situation, to the extent that it creates an outrage, an uproar around the country. And then just yesterday, actually, European Parliament passed a resolution calling for Georgian government to actually let Saakashvili go for medical treatment outside of Georgia. We'll see what comes out to it, maybe nothing. So it's a different kind of government, and Georgia is very careful now with what it does as a government, at least, to not annoy Russia, not to poke Russian bear. They're really afraid that Russia, if Georgia gets too close now to Ukraine and to support Ukraine, that Russia might retaliate, and Georgia would be in the receiving end of Russian aggression too. So, but at the same time, you have among the public, you have a lot of still very positive sentiment towards Russia, towards Ukraine, of course. And therefore, there is a little gap there, major disconnect between what the government is formally doing on one hand and what the public wants them to do to help Ukraine. So that's how it is with Georgia. With Romania and Bulgaria, two countries joined together, EU joined together with NATO. So basically the same time. Treat situation a little different ways. Romania has been very loyal to this Euro-Atlantic cause and European cause. So they've been allies with the US for a long time. There are bases there, American bases in Romania, which were used back in the times when American troops were both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Romanians also host the anti-missile radar systems, American systems there. So Romania and Ukraine had problems historically for a long time because they had territorial disputes. Actually, there were some territories within Ukraine that many people in Romania thought should rather belong to Romania. It even went as far as international arbitration at one point of time, specifically on that Snake Island already mentioned. So there was tons of tension between Romania and Ukraine, but since 2014, it's been basically 108 degrees turn for Romania. They've been coming strongly in support of Ukraine, and since February last year, even more so. So they're a very reliable ally of Ukraine. They hosted quite a lot of refugees, basically being bordering Ukraine. So from my hometown of Odessa, from my Odessa region, where I'm from, most refugees would basically go to Moldova and Romania. Some of them would go further down the roads into other European countries, but many ended up in Romania and Moldova. So Bulgaria is a little different. You actually have a sizable pro-Russian segment there among the public, but also political elites. They're really split on this war. For instance, the president currently is saying we should stay out of this war as far as we can. Russia is our historical ally. It goes back centuries. Bulgaria basically appeared as an independent state in many ways, thanks to Russian Empire fighting those successful wars against the Ottoman Empire at some point of time. So, yeah, and others are saying no. We are actually it's a brutal war. It's aggression. Ukraine is a victim. If we want to stand for the right thing, then we have to stand for Ukraine. And it was just recently discovered and been reported in the press that in the first days of the war, Bulgarian government actually was involved in a clandestine, very tacit, kind of not for the public, very confidential operation of supplying Ukraine with weapons. When Ukraine was really needing them badly, there was no this massive supply of weapons at those points in time. So Bulgaria said, okay, we can actually give you some, right? So this discussion is happening. So each country is kind of looking for their own way, like what to do about this. Moldova, technically not a Black Sea country because they don't have the stretch of the coastline, but definitely a member of this wider Black Sea region. Been really terrified by the whole war situation because a lot of people actually, I think for a good reason, expected if Russian troops would have a successful roll through the south of Ukraine, they wouldn't stop at the border of Moldova. They would actually go into Transnistria and maybe Moldova proper. That would have actually created a major problem because Romania is a major ally of Moldova, and they might have intervened. And Romania, of course, is a member of NATO and the EU, so that would create a different situation there. But didn't happen because Russia stopped well short of Moldova because they were stopped short of Moldova. But even now, in the recent days, Moldova is destabilized. You have a bunch of pro-Russian political forces there. There are provocateurs. There's been information about maybe some people coming to the country to create some serious trouble, including like taking hostages and destabilizing Moldova. So many eyes are now in the recent days on Moldova, actually, a small country there. But clearly, it's affected by this war. Other two countries in the South Caucasus, I mentioned Georgia, but Azerbaijan and Armenia, briefly. They had their own conflict, as you know, a couple of years ago. Azerbaijan been successful in taking away some land away from Armenia. Armenia controlled that land. Azerbaijan now took it away. And Azerbaijan now is playing its own game, obviously, specifically directed at their interests in the region, but being emboldened in many ways by what's happening with Russian invasion, seeing limits to Russian power, seeing Russia being weakened, being emboldened, obviously, by very serious support coming from Turkey. We'll see. And actually, Azerbaijan is very important now in terms of energy situation, because European Union, of course, has used this month since the start of Russian aggression to cut drastically its dependence on Russian energy supply, both oil and natural gas. And therefore, they're looking for countries that can actually give them some of that. Azerbaijan is right there. So it creates an interesting situation there because Azerbaijan actually has some problems with, say, civil rights and democracy and everything. And you have the same guy running this country, and that guy happens to be a son of the guy who was running the country before for a long time. So yeah, if you're European Union, you're probably not necessarily enjoying the situation, but situationally they're closing up to Azerbaijan. There are commissioners of European Union who are responsible for energy. They would go to Baku often. They would cooperate with Baku. It's one of those situations, frankly, when you have to choose the signs of values or interests. Ideally, if you're US or any other country which is like a liberal democracy out there, you would have both. You would need both values and interests. But sometimes you have to choose, maybe tactically, maybe situation. In this country, I don't need to tell you like how it happens. One of your major allies is region Saudi Arabia, for instance. And then you have trouble with Saudi Arabia, but historically you needed it. You still do. Or for instance, Americans do need Qatar or Kuwait, some other countries, which are not necessarily, the beacons of democracy, but you need them. So, I mean, same thing with Azerbaijan. So there you go. But actually with Russian war on Ukraine, I think American interests are involved and values involved. So it's not just outrage about violating territorial integrity, international law, committing war crimes, which goes into like values part of it, but also interest, because the US is not interested at all in letting Russia prevail in the region. It would really undermine the situation in the entire broader Eurasian region and so on. So that's what we have in the Black Sea region. It's volatile, it's anxious. A lot of countries trying to see what they can do. A bunch of countries in the region, even being members of NATO, they're not quite sure if they can be successfully protected if something happens to them, if they're attacked. For instance, there is of course Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the founding treaty of NATO from April of 1949. But there's been a long-term discussion about would the Article 5 actually be working effectively if one of the member states is attacked, and how quickly, and what would it actually mean? Because Article 5 does not specify that you need to send all your troops, for instance, Russia to the country which is under attack. No, it actually gives us some kind of a wiggling room, for a lot of countries to decide. Okay, some would send troops, and not necessarily today, but maybe like in the months since the aggression starts. Some would send non-lethal military assistance. Some would send money. Some would send humanitarian assistance, and so on. So yeah, there is a logic to believe that maybe Putin might try at some point of time to actually attack one of the members of NATO. Maybe not, because most probably the reasoning goes that he doesn't want conflict directly with NATO, being now weakened by the war against Ukraine. But who knows? If he's really cornered, if he really wants to turn this war into some kind of a defensive, patriotic, just, fair war against the menacing West, which is out there to destroy Russia. Within this narrative that he's building up there, clearly, attacking one of the NATO member states might actually be fitting quite well. And also it could be hybrid attack. Like for instance, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they might say, oh, our ethnic Russian citizens there or Russian speakers are discriminated against. So we have to somehow move in. So similar to what they're doing in Donbass now for almost 9 years. Right. So therefore, situation is really volatile. What can we see coming out of it? We don't know. I mean, it would depend on how the war ends, when it ends. There are so many, shades and types of definitions of when you talk about like defeat of Russia, victory of Ukraine, or vice versa. Hopefully not going to happen. But what do you mean actually by victory of Ukraine? What do you mean actually by defeat of Russia? There are so many ways to define what do you mean. It's actually been hinging on how the war proceeds in the coming weeks and months, maybe years, who knows? And what the end game there would be. That would definitely be determining a lot for the Black Sea region. So therefore, we can't quite provide specific outlines for what the Black Sea regional security would look like, because it would depend so much on how this war ends and when does it end. But there've been some sketching out there. I mean, America, for instance, the US, this country is very serious about Black Sea regional security. Actually, Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, had been with a visit to the region shortly before February 24th last year. He went to Georgia, Ukraine, and Romania. And I almost quote, it's very close to what he actually said. he said that the Black Sea regional security being strengthened is within American national interests, which was a unique thing to say. No one ever of that level of American political leadership or military leadership would utter anything like that. He also said that without Black Sea regional security being secured, provided for, there would not be a stable security for the entire eastern flank of NATO. So that is something. I mean, I guess that's where you have American strategic thinking about the region heading to. That both NATO strategic concept being delayed and rewritten because of Russian aggression. And also American last national security strategy has been really delayed a lot, quite a lot, few months before it was published, also because of this ongoing war, obviously. So we expect that both US as a global power still, superpower and a leader within NATO and NATO as an alliance would actually maybe come up with some kind of a Black Sea regional security strategy or vision or concept or something. So we'll see, but there is a lot of things that we can foresee. There are some things we cannot really foresee, but the Black Sea region would definitely be making some news. We would hear about developments in the region. And I would like to stop here so that we can actually have some Q&A discussion, and I'm eager to hear from you, please. Thank you.
Well, let me start, since you are a member of the CISM family, if you don't mind.
Yes.
By asking a kind of personal question.
Sure.
And, a number of my students are here today, which is great.
Right.
But we were talking in class on Tuesday
Yes.
about sort of the tensions between being an analyst of, really serious security matters like nuclear weapons versus being a human being.
Sure.
And I'm wondering how you think the fact that you are, a citizen of Ukraine from Odessa with, I'm sure, family and friends still there and care about it really, really deeply on a personal level.
Sure.
In what ways that helps you think more creatively and clearly and analytically, and in what ways those two roles are in conflict?
Great question. I can't say I'm not getting this question at other talks and events that I do here and there, but it's a great question. And yeah, it's hard. It is really hard to detach emotionally from the issue. Can I be successful? I'm trying to. In the first few weeks since February last year, for instance, in numerous roundtables every day online, I was sometimes struggling with keeping composure and some, maybe for a minute or two, even choking on tears and everything. I've learned how to deal with it, but there is still a lot of anxiety, personal anxiety for me. I'm trying to, distance myself from this and say, okay, look, I still have to be an expert analyst. I'm trying not to put too much emotion into this. But on the other hand, I think there is no discussion about who's the real victim there, who is in the right, who's in the wrong, who's, it's pretty black and white there. So therefore, when I say talk about why Ukraine should be helped, I'm talking as a Ukrainian citizen who hopes that Ukraine will be helped, but I also talking as an analyst who believes that there is tons of reasons why Ukraine should be assisted by a lot of countries in the West. So yeah, it probably adds some sense of urgency for sure. Like we cannot be just, it's not some abstract matter I'm talking about. I would love to talk about some abstract matter about the war in different part of the world. And I say I'm a specialist, an expert on that region, and that's far away from where I live, so I can be really, really non-involved emotionally. So that's not the case, and as you said, Nancy, yes, it's really becoming sometimes a problem, but I'm trying still to delineate, to distinguish, to distance from just being Ukrainian. For instance, when Ukraine does something wrong, I will talk about it. When there is an issue, for instance, about Zelensky maybe making some mistake before the war, during the war or something, I will talk about it. When there is an issue of corruption in Ukraine, there is a scandal, and that really undermines the unity in many ways, creates outrage within Ukraine and internationally, a lot of concern, I will talk about it. So, whenever I'm not trying to whitewash Ukraine, I'm not trying to say that Ukrainians and Ukrainian political leadership is always right. So, yeah, in that particular respect, I'm trying to be an analyst and expert, and that's how it is. But you're right. Sometimes it's really problematic. to detach one part of me from another.
Well, I mean, you and I probably went through graduate school at the same time when we were taught to detach, right? And taught to be an objective and keep our emotions whatnot.
Right.
And to see caring too much about the policy problem as something that would distort your analysis.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if there are ways in which you actually see the emotions and the personal commitment. Obviously sort of the strong feelings you have about the situation as something that's analytically useful too, if you harness it right, not something that you should try to tamp down completely.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's analytically useful. I don't know if I have to like nurture that part of my inner urges, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't prevent me from being able to make any decisions. Like for instance, now there is a lot of talk about the long-term security options for Ukraine going forward, like say after the war. Actually, most of my talks at this time, and I'm doing 7 talks in like 3.5 days, are focused on that. I had a talk at Carnegie yesterday, SIPA, and also Georgetown University before yesterday, and Atlantic Council yesterday, and so on. A lot of Ukrainians say we would like to be members of NATO, for instance. And I would try to explain, yeah, that'd be a good thing for us, maybe, but we couldn't get it soon enough, at least. So let's be realistic. So yeah, I'm trying to be sober in my analysis, all right? Or for instance, people say, oh, let's talk about security guarantees that other countries like the US can provide to Ukraine. So next time Russia attacks, maybe America is going to send their troops, to help Ukrainians fight Russians. And again, I'm saying, no, not going to happen. Didn't happen this time, not going to happen next time. So I'm giving this examples of like trying to be realistic. There are certain things I want as a part of Ukraine. Actually, no one in Odessa, in my immediate family right now, they're all dispersed. My mother and my brother are in Western Ukraine, away from fighting. My nephew, for instance, in France with his 2 little kids, they left in the first day of the war when it's still allowed. So yeah, it's very personal. It's very personal. I haven't been to my apartment for a year. I don't know what's going to happen to my job at my university. Well, I have a university. Many universities are in ruins in Ukraine. Mine is luckily undamaged physically, but what's going to happen, when the people wouldn't have money to pay for tuition for their kids because they don't have war. They don't have money anymore because they have jobs because of the war. Economy is destroyed, it's in ruins. Okay, would I have students returning from Europe? Say they went to Europe, they now enrolled in European universities. Would they prefer rather stay there and get their degree, not come back to Odessa University? Would the people actually have enough money? We're in the demographic drop anyway, even before the war. So I don't know anything about my future, my personal future. I don't make any plans, so it's really personal. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm trying to detach from that and saying, okay, well, I have people, and I assume in this room, there are people who probably care about Ukraine and wish us well. But at the same time, well, it's not your personal issue, it's the same extent as it's mine. So I will try to understand and explain to you like what it means, and actually be above the ground a little bit and realistic and detached. It's not easy, like I said, but I'm trying to. I'm doing my best. Thank you.
We really appreciate you trying it.
Thank you.
Let me open it up so
Right.
all of you can ask questions.
Okay, so 3 hands, 4 hands, 5 hands. Good. Any other? Do you want me to pick?
Yes.
Okay. Hannah, who was a Fulbrighter in Ukraine, whom I know personally, so therefore, if you don't mind, please.
Thanks so much for the lecture, Volodymyr. So one of the things kind of that's been interesting to me is, you talk all about the dynamics of Black Sea security. Why hasn't Foreign Minister Kuleba made more of a direct pitch to countries outside of the immediate framework? So I'm talking about countries that are affected directly as a result of the blockade, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka. I know that there have been, he did a brief tour in Africa, but why hasn't the foreign ministry made a greater attempt at building out those relationships with countries that are really also being affected by this war, to kind of counteract the Russian narrative that Russia is here for you, blah 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 blah.
Well, several things then. It's a great question. The position of global south is emerging as an important subject to study. And I think both Ukraine and US, and basically, if you like, this golden billion or whatever, should pay more attention. to what's happening in the global south, because clearly the position of Europe, say, plus Canada, plus US, some other countries actually in the east, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, very supportive of Ukraine. Others are not. You know, some are sitting on the fence, some are saying it's not our war, we're neutral, some are actually sympathizing openly with Russia. South Africa, for instance, now planning to have exercises together with South and China. So yeah, why is it happening? First of all, because there's a lot of anti-imperialistic feelings there, anti-American feelings, and a lot of inertia from the times of Cold War times. So they see, you know, the West as being the one to blame for the war, Russia being defending and so on, still being voice for the underprivileged and so on, and developing countries and so on. That's one thing. And another thing is the Ukrainian foreign ministry is overwhelmed, obviously, with war. You need to understand that too. They are human beings. They're working 24/7, you know, without sleep, sure. They're doing the best they can. They underfunded too. You know, historically, if you talk about Africa, for instance, you would have one Ukrainian embassy per like 6 to 7 countries at best. And you would have a Russian embassy in each of those countries. A lot of people with a lot of experience working with African countries, knowing really well major political players there, and what buttons to push, and how to influence this narrative, you know, and create more of that pro-Russian narrative in those countries. So that's another fact. Recently, Zelensky actually announced that Ukraine is going to be expanding the network of our embassies in Africa, but it's not going to be producing any results soon. There is an enormous inertia there. You can fight it. You know, for Americans, actually, the position of the global south has been also kind of an unpleasant surprise. And Secretary Blinken has been to Africa several times since February last year. But again, you know, maybe America has more leverage. Maybe they can actually say, okay, we want you to maybe take a stronger position in this war, because you know what's our position is. And you also, you know, we also believe that it's easy to see who is right and who is wrong in this war. Is it convincing enough to African counterparts, even of this country? Sometimes yes, sometimes not. You know, sometimes I would say, okay, but we still don't want to take sides because it's not our war. That's the whole logic of the Cold War times, when you had this non-alignment movement, you know, and they still perceive the situation like, okay, it's West versus Russia, with Ukraine somewhere in between. It's not, why would she be part of it? So maybe some of them would ask something of US, as often happens. Okay, you want to have a stronger position by us in support of Ukraine. Okay, there is something we need, you know, and you, US, you can deliver. So with Ukraine, we don't have this prowess and the potential and resources to deliver. So there are so many issues out there. You know, we're trying. I spoke a number of roundtables, like one in Uganda and Kampala, one, you know, I've been speaking for a lot of time for one major English-speaking TV channel called Channels in Nigeria, you know, and others do too. But, you know, so far it's probably a drop in the ocean. What's the right expression? Yeah, but something, you know, we're trying, you know, we're trying, but it's not easy. It's going to be systemic work. And well, Russia has a lot of strong narrative position. A lot of people say that losing the narrative war since February last year, well, maybe in Europe, maybe in America, but not in Africa. And they've been there for a long time. The Russian propaganda machine is well funded. You know, they have some creative people there. You know, they know how to do it. And before we're able to reverse maybe the sentiments in the global south, it's going to take time and a lot of effort and a lot of money too. Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, you and back.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been very educational. I'm primarily in domestic, so this is really informative. But we were learning this week in Nancy's class about like deterrence, and a lot of those theories rely on them being rational. And you mentioned that Putin is no longer within that category. And so I just was wondering how you think that could impact.
Sure. Well, first of all, yes, we knew Putin for most of the time, since he was a leader of Russia, as more of a rational, careful player, and actually thinking through his next moves really well, and preferring often not big strategic bold moves, but more like tactical little steps. He would take a step and then he would reassess what's going on, what's the reaction, can I make another step or not? So that's exactly not what happened in this war since February last year. You know, What made him move, what made him change? There are all sorts of theories out there. I'm not gonna go into this political psychology or something. The cognitive psychology or something, is it COVID, is it something else? Some people say, okay, of course, he's gravely ill, so he's gonna die soon, so he doesn't care about what happens with the rest of us. Not only Russians or Ukrainians, but the rest of the world, so he doesn't care. If that's what's happening, well, not a very rosy scenario there, but yeah, it's not, are we all doomed? I don't know. So probably not. But if he still has some rationality left in him, for instance, he might back off at some point in time. And the whole question is like, what do you do to make him stop and maybe reverse his invasion to Ukraine? Are you actually providing him with tons of this off-ramp exit strategies, opportunities to save the pace, as they say, and so on, which the West had been trying, the Biden administration has been trying? Or are you actually doubling down, sending more assistance to Ukraine, and you're basically saying we need to defeat Russia? What's going to work better? The prevailing attitude in this administration is a former one. So basically, for instance, in the last summer, no, let's not give Ukraine HIMARS, multiple rocket launch systems. Let's not give long distance kind of missiles. That would be escalatory. Russia would use it to escalate. What does Putin do in return? Does he de-escalate? No, he doubles down. He announces so-called referenda. He announces so-called annexations. He goes forward with mobilization of Russian troops. So yeah, well, so I guess it's a big teaching moment right there. But again, maybe this tactics of incremental small moves with this administration. Okay, we're gonna give another type of weapon to Ukraine. Let's see what happens. Okay, Russia does not escalate. Okay, let's maybe think about something else. Continuously shifting, those red lines. Because Ukraine already received throughout this year tons of weapons which were a year ago were considered absolutely no, we shouldn't give it to Ukraine because Russia would escalate. Can Russia actually escalate? That's another thing. They've been pretty much tried everything they have against Ukraine, except for weapons of mass destruction. And that's not just nukes, it's also bacteriological, biological. But then people said they've been really terrified. If you talk about major experts, say in this country a few months ago, people were saying, oh yeah, we should be really careful because we shouldn't corner Putin. But then people said, okay, maybe he's not going to do that, because first of all, he's been talked to. Did he listen? I don't know. Director of CIA, Mr. Burns, went and talked to Mr. Patrushev. So basically his counterpart in Russia, and delivered some assurances that if Russia uses weapons of mass destruction against Ukraine, that would probably trigger a conventional weapons strike by NATO countries, against Russian troops in Ukraine. That would be dramatic escalation of the conflict, obviously. We don't want to go there. Obviously, but I think it was convincing enough for them, maybe. But also, say they use tactical nuke on Ukrainian troops. Would the war be over and Ukraine be like surrendering? No. The war will continue. So actually the use of the weapons of mass destruction wouldn't be necessarily tactically battleground kind of useful move for Russia, but would definitely deteriorate their relations with the rest of the world. For instance, China, India, they told him openly, publicly, don't go there. So if Russia uses those weapons, definitely both Beijing and Delhi would be extremely unhappy. The rest of the world, maybe even the global south, people would say, oh my God, Russians really went too far. So maybe that's it. So therefore we are seeing the maximum or the ceiling of escalation they're capable of vis-a-vis Ukraine. So does it mean that you can just take all of those barriers and obstacles and limits and take them off and just send whatever you have in US or other countries to Ukraine weapons? Probably not. But as we've seen recently, with tanks and other things, a lot of things being going to Ukraine. Another problem is, of course, that the storages here are depleted. Many types of weapons. The military production cycles are now running 24/7 in this country as well. One backs to wonder, like when we saw the last month's amazing job creation numbers in this country. Does it have anything to do with production and military? I didn't see the fine print. I don't know, maybe not. But I assume that actually, of course, if you just create more factories and plants producing shells and munition and weapons in this country, that's a lot of jobs. Actually, in the South, like for instance, producing more HIMARS, the actual systems and missiles for it. It's a big deal for the state of Arkansas, which is not exactly the richest state in this country. So it's probably much broader answer to your question than you actually probably expected from me. But yeah, I think we should be very careful when we threat with Putin, and we don't know exactly how much rationality, if any at all, is left in him. People mostly believe that still he would not want to be like physically eliminated or his regime to be crumbling, so therefore he probably wouldn't go too far in terms of what weapons he may use. But there might be limits of that theory as well. Yeah. So yeah, you please. Yeah. And I'll try to be briefer because we're
Probably.
Yaroslav.
So my question is about naval power.
Yeah.
Values and interests that you mentioned before.
Yes, right.
Before 2014, even before 2014,
Yeah.
Russia, they were had power in the Black Sea.
Right.
As you mentioned, together with Turkey, they were navigating the powers. After
Right.
2014 occupation of Crimea,
Yes.
they got all the power. However, after Ukrainians stuck and sunk the warship Moscow,
Yeah.
The narrative in the world has changed because
Yeah.
the world saw that the power, the immense power of Russian Navy is a myth. They could,
It's not a myth, it's probably just irrelevant.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I've heard some experts talking about Ukraine being obviously after the victory, Ukraine being the main playing the main role in the Black Sea.
Right.
What would it mean
Yeah.
for the region
Yeah.
of the Black
Yeah.
Sea and also for other
Sure.
countries? As Aaron mentioned, there are a lot of countries outside of our region who depend on that.
Right.
What do you think would be Turkey's reaction to
Okay.
that change of power in the region?
Well, first of all, yes, indeed, in terms of the naval power, it's a big moment, teaching moment for us to think like we thought that we are kind of doomed because Russia has a navy, we basically don't. So, they're going to have upper hand, dominate, prevail anyhow. But now we're seeing that, with anti-ship missiles and so on, maybe you can actually do fine. Do you actually need, if you're Ukraine, a big new navy? Because it actually takes time and takes enormous amount of money for Ukraine to build a new navy. Ideally, I think going forward, we should think about it. But in the nearest future, that's not possible. So maybe we should continue relying on this anti-ship missiles and other things, and Air Force and other things, and naval drones and aerial drones too, to just fight back Russians if we need to. So in terms of Ukraine being a leader in the region, I think we can become one. Yes, we've been many discussions for years and years, like can we? And when most people said, well, probably not. Yeah, but now after this heroic fight back against Russia, Ukraine really has something going for them. You have agency, you have some confidence. Yes, the country is bleeding enormously. The country is definitely, it's a difficult economic situation, obviously, but at the same time, in terms of agency, self-confidence, ability to project ideas, ideology for the region, like Ukraine is really in different situation than before February last year. Therefore, yeah, it could become a leader in the region. But in terms of Turkey, we'll see. They are on the eve of their own very important elections, which may go either way. There will be some evolution, maybe of their thinking about the role in the region. For most of the time since the end of Cold War, it was more or less of they call it condominium or duumvirat, two countries dividing the region, Russia and Turkey, with others trying to do something what they can. Will Turkey actually be shifting their position or continue balancing? We'll see. Again, it depends on how the war ends. When does it end? If Russia is resolutely defeated, then Turkey will be emboldened, to work more with Ukraine. If not, maybe they'll continue their kind of a balancing game. But we'll see. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, please.
Well, thank you for coming and sharing your perspective. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the domestic internal politics
Yeah.
in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I know a lot has changed. I think now, I can't exactly, I think like 80% are in favor of joining NATO.
Even more. Yeah.
Or even, is there any significant opposition or tension within Ukraine
No.
today?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how you
No, there's an enormous consolidation. Because of this war, which is appearing as a very horrific war, it's a genocidal war, it's anti-Ukrainian. so everything Ukrainian, everyone who is Ukrainian and everything which is Ukrainian is under threat, direct attack. Because of that, it really brings us together, including people who are not even, let's say, ethnic Ukrainian, or not even, say, Ukrainian speakers. Actually, most of them actually live in the south and east of Ukraine. That's most devastation where you have is there. So that's a factor. So actually, we can actually say that it's total end to Russia's, soft power presence in Ukraine. They had the concept of Russian world. They wanted to include part of Ukraine into it, but that's it. That's over. The Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Russia would always be its enemy, it's deadly mortal enemy. It's not going to change. So yeah, consolidation, obviously, and therefore opposition is very considerate of that, very wide. They're supportive of President Zelensky. They're not critical of him, even maybe when sometimes he deserves to be criticized. Could it be a problem in the long run that he has, this absolute unopposed kind of run? That's a good question, maybe. But for now, there is this understanding that we should be, in the light of this aggression, we should be actually getting our act together. Right? But also, basically, the pro-Russian part of political spectrum, the segments of political spectrum in Ukraine, is basically non-existing anymore. Some people went to Russia or elsewhere. The chapters of the main opposition pro-Russian parties in the regions, in various cities, dismissed themselves. So therefore, it's not there. It's not going to be coming back anytime soon. So that's another reality for Ukraine, But at the same time, having said that, Zelensky is not like God or Tsar or king, like Putin is, because Russia does what Putin says that Russia should do. Zelensky still has to deal with public opinion, civil society, opposition, parliament, army, so many factors there, so right now he is a rock star, because he is presiding over this heroic resistance. Imagine the moment when he has to sign some kind of a peace deal with Russia, where quite realistically it might be that Ukraine would not be able to really quickly liberate all our lands. His fortunes might quickly turn and his ratings might go down. We may remember that his ratings were in the upper 20s prior to February 24th. And immediately skyrocketed internationally and domestically because of his very strong position. He's rallied us around the flag. He really did a good PR job. He's a great communicator. He talked to people around the world. He knew what to do. His skills of an actor, professional actor, helped him a lot to stand up to the job. So yeah, but for now, it's incredible unity. If Russia is trying to upset that unity, they're failing. Apparently someone in Russia, and it tells you how little they know Ukraine, even though they care about Ukraine and being under their control, but they never really invested in studying Ukraine and understanding Ukraine. Apparently someone in the Kremlin said, okay, let's rain those missiles on Ukraine infrastructure, energy infrastructure, so the people would be without power, electricity, and being cold, and that would create a kind of a rebellion in the country against the government, and people would come to the streets demanding that Zelensky signs a peace treaty with Russia. Nothing of the sort happened. It could have happened. It's completely unrealistic. It's naive, thinking. On the contrary, people are even more antagonistic, even more angry about what Russia does. So therefore, coupled with what they do at the battleground, coupled with what they do with war crimes that they commit. Now they also try to freeze us to death. And they also tried to starve us to death, like it was with the great Ukrainian famine in 1932-33, early in the war, when they blockaded our agriculture, when they actually destroyed a lot of our harvest in the fields. The Russian tanks were shelling at tractors of Ukrainian farmers, collecting the harvest. That's really reminiscent. If you couple it all together, of course, you have this Ukraine, which is really different, which is really unified about this new identity that we're getting. And we'll see, will it be lasting? Can we actually withstand this tremendous amount of destruction for our economy? I hope so. Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yes,
let
maybe-
you take one more
Yeah,
question.
okay, I'm
and
so
then
sorry.
I'm gonna have to
Yes.
leave the room quickly so
Yeah.
that the next class can get in.
Right.
And we can talk a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry about taking too long to answer. Yes, please, sir.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Alvin Bradford, a first year PhD student at SVP. My question is about Russia's position on the Security Council.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's a bit of naivete on my part in asking this, but you know, as I understand the extent to which the UN can do something or not, but given
Yeah.
the humanitarian crisis, the threat of the war to the region, more generally, do you see
Yeah.
sort of the United Nations adding more pressure on Russia?
Yeah.
You know, I know that it sits on the Security
Sure.
Council, but do you see that changing anytime soon?
It's a great question. It's not naivete at all. It's a very good question. Well, first of all, yes, indeed, UN is limited in what it can do because of what you've mentioned. Russia is a permanent member with veto power. So, yeah. So no anti-Russian decision going to come ever to Security Council. Whoever is thinking that we should just ditch Russia from Security Council, you know, it's not naive. It's not realistic. It's naive in my view. You know, we can try, we can criticize them. They're often isolated there in minority when there's a low vote, but I don't think we can actually think about, you know, doing away with Russia in UN. UN is not completely futile though. I mean, for instance, they were involved in putting together a grain deal with Turkey, so that's a big deal. Secretary Guterres was extremely happy about it, so he was really careful about this whole deal. Other thing that there are many institutions within UN structure that are also involved. There is UNICEF, helping Ukrainian children, because more than 50% of Ukrainian children are brutally displaced. Can you imagine that number? It's actually about 60% of Ukrainian children are not living in their homes anymore for the last year. They are elsewhere. Or UNESCO, you know, the cultural heritage that recently actually provided the status of historically protected area to the downtown of my hometown of Odessa. Would it prevent Russia from striking and destroying that downtown? Probably not, but still it's a big move. It's a right move in the right direction. So I think UN is not completely futile. They're trying, but they're limited, and we knew it. You know, and some people said, "Well, it's their own people. They can't do much." You know, they can't do much. We need a serious reform. We need a serious reform in UN for it to be more bold and actually decisive and not that timid and maybe being able to make some decisions. But it's a great question. You know, I think that UN, of course, is not playing as much of a role as we all hoped. Or, for instance, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE for that matter. But they're not completely futile and useless, so they actually play some role. And I invite those whose questions I wasn't able to take to follow me in the lobby, and maybe I can answer your questions directly. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.